When my son got married, I kept one quiet truth to myself. Not because I was afraid of losing him, not because I didn't trust his wife, but because, at 72, I had learned that peace of mind sometimes depends on what you don't explain too early. I never told Daniel or Alina who really controlled the house they moved into. And after the wedding, that silence changed everything. A few days later, I would overhear a plan that made me understand why staying quiet had saved me. Before I continue, if you're drawn to stories where patience, restraint, and quiet intelligence matter more than confrontation, take a moment to subscribe. This story doesn't rush, but it doesn't miss either. From the outside, everything looked ideal. Daniel had just married Alina, radiant and confident, the kind of woman who speaks with certainty even when she's asking for permission. When they told me they were struggling with rent and needed somewhere temporary, I didn't hesitate. The house was big, too big, some people said, for a woman my age living alone, so I said yes. I told them they could move in. I told them I was happy to help. I told them it made sense for family to be together after such a big life change. What I didn't tell them was how carefully that house was protected. At the time, there was no tension, no raised voices, no red flags you could point to and say, that's the moment everything went wrong. There never is. Things like this don't start loudly. They start comfortably. Alina arrived with confidence, not hostility. She talked about flow and function, about how the house had great bones. She used words that sounded harmless, even complimentary, but they landed with an assumption underneath them. When we repaint, when we rearrange, when we make it more practical. Daniel smiled and nodded. He was happy. That mattered to me. I had raised him alone after his father passed, and I wanted his marriage to begin without friction, without a mother who questioned everything. So I observed instead. I noticed how Alina's mother, Ruth, began visiting more often than expected, always with a reason, always with concern, concern about the stairs, concern about how much space I had to manage, concern about whether a house like this was too much responsibility for someone my age. She never said it unkindly, that was the clever part. Daniel stayed out of it. He always had. Conflict made him uncomfortable. He believed silence kept the peace, not realizing that silence can also be interpreted as permission. I told myself I was imagining things. That adjustment takes time, that new marriages come with growing pains. But one afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. I had gone out with my friend Joan Fisher for coffee and returned because I'd forgotten my glasses. I opened the door quietly, not intending to interrupt anything. That's when I heard my name, not spoken cruelly, spoken strategically. Ruth's voice came first, calm and assured. Alina's followed, measured, thoughtful. They didn't know I was there. They talked about timelines, about what would be best for everyone, about how people my age often resist change, even when change is necessary. They talked about comfort, about safety, about easing me into a smaller place before it gets harder. I stood in the hallway, keys still in my hand, listening. No one mentioned asking me, no one mentioned whether I wanted to go anywhere at all. They spoke as if the decision had already been made and they were simply figuring out how to deliver it gently. That was the moment I stopped doubting my instincts. I didn't walk into the room. I didn't interrupt. I didn't confront them or demand explanations. I slipped back out the door just as quietly as I'd entered and sat in my car for a long time. At my age, you don't react quickly, you react correctly. I called Joan and asked her to meet me again. When I told her what I'd overheard, she didn't gasp or dramatize it. She just said, "Then it's a good thing you stayed silent." She was right. Because what Daniel and Alina didn't know, what Ruth certainly didn't know, was that the house wasn't just a house. It was a structure, legally, deliberately, protected in ways they hadn't considered. And the more confident they became, the more visible their intentions grew. That evening, I returned home, smiled, asked about dinner, and listened as Alina spoke about a senior living community she'd heard good things about. I nodded. Calmly, attentively. Inside, I had already made a decision. I wasn't going to argue, I wasn't going to accuse, and I certainly wasn't going to leave. Instead, I was going to watch. Because when people believe they're safe, they show you exactly who they are and exactly how far they plan to go. Once you hear a plan spoken out loud, even quietly, you can never unhear it. After that afternoon in the hallway, I stopped pretending I didn't understand what was happening. I stopped assigning innocent explanations to things that were no longer ambiguous. What I didn't stop doing was listening. At my age, impatience is a luxury I don't indulge. Experience has taught me that people reveal more when they believe you're unaware. Alina became more attentive after that, not warmer, more deliberate. She asked questions about my routines, my appointments, my habits. Questions framed as concern but asked with the precision of someone gathering information. Ruth's visits increased. She started bringing pamphlets. Brochures left casually on the kitchen counter. Communities with names like Serenity Gardens and Golden Oaks, always described as temporary options or just something to consider. Daniel noticed none of it. Or if he did, he chose not to engage. He worked long hours, came home tired, trusted that the two women he loved would never push me into something I didn't want. Trust, I realized, is often the quietest accomplice. If you're still listening, this is where things usually break down. This is where people confront, argue, demand reassurance. I did none of that. Instead, I began documenting. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just carefully dates, phrases. Who said what and when, messages that framed decisions as already agreed upon. Suggestions repeated often enough to feel like conclusions. I didn't need proof yet. I needed patterns. One evening, Ruth mentioned conservatorship in passing. Not as a threat, as an option. She spoke about it like something helpful families do when someone becomes overwhelmed. Alina nodded thoughtfully. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing. That silence was louder than anything Ruth said. That night, I lay awake and thought about something I hadn't considered in years: authority, not physical strength, not dominance, authority over my own life. I had spent decades managing finances, raising a child, building a household that ran on order and foresight. I hadn't lost that capacity simply because time had passed. The next morning, I called Thomas Reed. I didn't explain everything at once. I didn't accuse anyone. I told him I wanted a review, a quiet one. I wanted to ensure that my affairs reflected my intentions, not assumptions made by others. Thomas listened without interruption. Then he said something I found comforting. Silence isn't surrender, he said. Sometimes it's strategy. We met 2 days later. He reviewed the documents Alina and Daniel had never seen. The trust, the clauses, the contingencies. He confirmed what I already knew. Everything was in my control, and more importantly, it would remain that way unless I chose otherwise. That knowledge settled something inside me. At home, I became agreeable in small ways. I allowed Alina to rearrange a bookshelf. I thanked Ruth for her concern. I let conversations drift toward future possibilities without correcting their assumptions. Comfort breeds confidence. Confidence breeds mistakes. Daniel asked one evening whether I'd thought more about downsizing someday. I told him I had and that I wasn't in a hurry. He seemed relieved by that answer. He thought it meant compliance. It meant patience. A few days later, I overheard another conversation. This one bolder, less careful. They spoke about timelines again, about how once certain steps were taken, resistance would become impractical. I listened until the end. Then I went to my room and wrote everything down. The plan was becoming clearer, and so was my response. I wasn't preparing to fight. I was preparing to finish this cleanly, lawfully, and without raising my voice. Because the most powerful position isn't confrontation. It's control exercised quietly before anyone realizes it's already been decided. By the time you understand someone's intentions, the real question is no longer what they're planning, it's how far they believe they're allowed to go. After the second conversation I overheard, the one where timelines were discussed as if I were a logistical detail instead of a living person, I stopped hoping Daniel would intervene on his own. Hope has a way of softening judgment, and I couldn't afford softness anymore. What I could afford was clarity. I began noticing how Alina spoke around me rather than to me. She'd include me in conversations only after decisions had already been shaped. She'd say things like, "We were thinking," or "It might be easier if," always framed gently, always positioned as helpful. Ruth was less careful. She'd grown comfortable enough to let impatience show. She commented on how slowly I moved in the mornings, on how complicated it must be to keep track of a house this size, on how most people your age eventually prefer something simpler. She never asked if I did. Daniel heard these remarks. I saw him hear them. His shoulders would tense slightly, his eyes would flicker toward me, and then he would say nothing. He chose neutrality, not realizing neutrality always favors the person applying pressure. I didn't correct him, not yet. Instead, I leaned into routine. Predictability makes people careless. When they think they know your patterns, they stop hiding theirs. I continued my mornings as usual, tea by the window, a short walk around the block. Afternoons spent reading or sorting through old paperwork I pretended was sentimental but was, in truth, strategic. Alina mistook my quiet for acquiescence. She began discussing changes more openly, contractors mentioned casually, storage solutions for when you don't need all this space anymore, even suggestions about which of my things I might want to take with me. Not if, one evening, Daniel brought up the idea of updating the house, not renovating, updating. He spoke carefully as if choosing the right words might make the subject safer. I asked him one question. Why? He hesitated, then said something that confirmed everything. Well, if things change. Things, not my wishes, not our conversations, just things. I nodded and said nothing. That night I reviewed every document Thomas had organized for me. Slowly. Thoroughly. The trust language was clear, the conditions explicit. Any attempt to remove me, pressure me, or override my autonomy triggered consequences that couldn't be undone with apologies. I slept well. The next week, Alina invited her mother to stay just a few days. Those days stretched easily into more. Ruth began treating the house like a staging area, moving items, commenting on layouts, occupying space without asking. She referred to the guest room as temporary. She referred to my bedroom as upstairs. Language reveals intent long before actions do. I documented everything, dates, phrases, witnesses. I wasn't building a case out of anger. I was building a record out of necessity. At dinner one night, Ruth mentioned that a friend of hers had helped her own mother transition into assisted living without all the drama. She laughed as she said it like it was an inside joke. Alina smiled politely. Daniel stared at his plate. I realized then that waiting for him to protect me was no longer an option. Whatever he was struggling with, loyalty, fear, avoidance, it was already costing him more than he understood. Later that evening, Alina knocked on my door. She asked how I was feeling. Not emotionally, physically. She asked if I ever felt overwhelmed, if I ever worried about being alone. I answered honestly. No, she looked surprised. That moment mattered. People who are certain of their narrative don't expect resistance, not even quiet resistance. The following afternoon, I overheard the most telling conversation yet. This one wasn't hypothetical, it was operational. They spoke about paperwork, about how things would be easier once authority was consolidated, about how families sometimes need to step in when someone refuses to accept reality. Reality. I didn't interrupt, I didn't gasp. I didn't feel panic, I felt resolved. That evening I called Thomas and told him it was time to proceed to the next step. Not publicly, not confrontationally, just structurally. He understood immediately. Once this is in motion, he said, there's no reversing it. That's the point, I replied. At dinner, Alina spoke cheerfully about a future weekend trip. Ruth mentioned how nice it would be to have the house settled before then. I smiled. I asked about dessert. I listened. Inside, I had crossed a line of my own. I was no longer reacting to their plans. I was finalizing mine, and they still believed I was unaware. That belief was about to cost them everything they assumed was already theirs. There's a moment when preparation stops feeling theoretical and starts feeling urgent. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon disguised as a polite suggestion. Alina approached me in the kitchen while I was making tea. Her tone was warm, almost rehearsed. She mentioned a friend who'd recently helped her own mother simplify things. She talked about how relieving it was when decisions were taken off her shoulders. How grateful her mother had been afterward. I listened without interrupting. Then she asked carefully whether I'd ever considered giving Daniel medical authority, just in case. That was the first time I felt something sharpen inside me. Not fear, recognition. People don't raise that subject unless they're already imagining a future where your consent is optional. I thanked her for her concern and told her I'd think about it. She smiled, satisfied, and left the room believing she'd planted something useful. What she didn't know was that the seed she'd planted confirmed everything I needed to know. That evening, I went through my files again, slowly, methodically. I reviewed medical directives, power of attorney clauses, trust conditions. Thomas had ensured everything was airtight months earlier, but I wanted to feel the weight of it myself. Control doesn't come from knowing documents exist. It comes from understanding them. The trust was clear. Any attempt to undermine my autonomy financially, medically, or legally nullified future benefits automatically. No warnings, no negotiations, just consequences. I slept deeply that night. The next day, Ruth became bolder. She rearranged furniture without asking, spoke openly about how much easier the layout would be once I wasn't navigating it daily. She talked about me as if I were already absent. Daniel was there, he heard it. He flinched but said nothing. Silence again. If you're still listening, this is the part where many people explode. Where they demand explanations or issue ultimatums. I did neither. Instead, I allowed their confidence to grow. I agreed to small changes. I let conversations drift into future plans without correcting assumptions. I became cooperative enough to confirm what they already believed. That resistance was fading. In reality, I was removing doubt. Thomas and I met privately later that week. I told him everything I'd overheard. The medical authority suggestion, the shift in language, the timelines, he didn't look surprised. They're escalating, he said. That means they feel safe. He prepared the next set of documents quietly. Notifications that wouldn't be delivered yet. Safeguards that would activate automatically once certain actions were taken. I didn't ask when. I didn't need to. At home, Daniel asked me how I was feeling about the future. He said it carefully, like a child approaching a sleeping animal. I told him the truth. I feel prepared. He nodded, relieved by what he thought was acceptance. That weekend, Alina invited friends over without asking. They toured the house like it was a preview. Ruth pointed out areas she'd improve. I stayed in my chair, smiling politely, watching people imagine a future that didn't include me, but depended entirely on my silence. The irony didn't escape me. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I heard voices again. Lower this time. Confident, they spoke about next steps, about timing things so I wouldn't feel pressured, about how families sometimes have to step in for the greater good. I recorded it. Not secretly out of malice, but carefully out of necessity. The following morning, I went for a walk. The air was cool, clear. I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Because when you stop hoping someone will do the right thing for you, you start doing it for yourself. By the time I returned home, I knew this chapter of my life was approaching its end. Not with shouting, not with drama, with paperwork. And when the moment came, and it would come soon, there would be no confusion about who had control. They believed they were guiding me toward an inevitable outcome. What they didn't realize was that the outcome had already been decided. Just not by them. Chapter 5. By the time people begin preparing paperwork about you, they've already decided you no longer belong at the center of your own life. I sensed the shift before I saw it. Conversations stopped including me entirely. Decisions were discussed in the next room, then presented as summaries, polished, simplified, and framed as concern. Alina had mastered that tone, gentle. Certain, the tone of someone who believes resistance has already been worn down. Ruth stopped pretending altogether. She spoke openly about what comes next. About how families sometimes need to step in before things become difficult. About how much easier it is when transitions are handled early before confusion sets in. Confusion. That word appeared more often than it should have. Daniel remained quiet, but his silence had changed. It was no longer uncertainty. It was avoidance. He kept himself busy, left early, came home late, and trusted that whatever was being handled in his absence would be handled responsibly. He told himself that staying out of it was kindness. It wasn't. One afternoon, Alina sat beside me with her tablet and showed me photos of places I hadn't asked to see. Clean apartments, bright common rooms, smiling people my age posed mid-laugh. Just options, she said. No pressure. I looked at the images and then at her. Who chose these? I asked. She hesitated just long enough. I did, she said. Daniel agreed it was sensible. Sensible is a word people use when they want your consent without discussion. I thanked her and handed the tablet back. She looked pleased. She mistook restraint for agreement. That evening, I called Thomas. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize anything. I told him we had reached the point where intentions were no longer hypothetical. They're organizing around you, he said. That means it's time. We reviewed the sequence, not to confront but to conclude. Certain documents were activated automatically once attempts at displacement became evident. Certain privileges dissolved quietly when lines were crossed. No announcements, no warnings, just outcomes. Thomas reminded me of something important. Once this moves forward, he said, they'll believe you're reacting, you'll be revealing. That distinction mattered. At home, the atmosphere grew heavier. Alina stopped asking questions and started making statements. Ruth moved freely through the house as if she belonged there. Daniel watched from the margins, telling himself it would resolve on its own. It never does. I overheard a conversation that removed any remaining doubt. They spoke about medical assessments, about authority, about ensuring decisions could be made efficiently if I became resistant. Resistant, I recorded it. Not because I needed proof anymore, but because I wanted precision. That night I slept without anxiety. Anxiety belongs to people who don't know where they stand. I knew exactly where I stood. The following morning, I told Daniel I had an appointment. I didn't say with whom, he didn't ask. Thomas finalized everything by the end of the week. All that remained was timing. At dinner that night, Alina mentioned inviting someone over the following Sunday. She said it casually, like it was an afterthought. I recognized the strategy immediately. Witnesses. I smiled and said nothing. Because when people believe the future is already settled, they stop hiding the mechanisms they're using to get there. Sunday would clarify everything, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, through documentation that spoke more clearly than any argument ever could. And once that happened, no one would be confused about who had authority or how quietly it had always been protected. Chapter 6. Sunday arrived without ceremony. That more than anything confirmed my suspicions. No tension in the air, no nervous energy. Alina moved through the house with the confidence of someone hosting an event she believed she controlled. Ruth supervised from the dining room, correcting small details, adjusting settings, issuing instructions as if she were already the authority in the room. Daniel stayed quiet. He always did when pressure built. Silence had become his refuge. I dressed carefully that morning, not formally, intentionally. I wanted to look like myself, steady, composed, present. People behave differently when they believe you're already diminished. I had no intention of helping that illusion along. The visitor Alina mentioned arrived shortly after lunch. A woman introduced as a family friend, polite, observant. She asked questions that felt casual but weren't. Questions about how long I'd lived here, how I managed day-to-day tasks, whether I ever felt overwhelmed. Assessment questions I answered honestly, calmly, without defensiveness. Ruth watched closely. Alina smiled too often. Daniel avoided eye contact. I didn't confront the situation. I didn't object to the visit. I allowed it to unfold exactly as they had planned. Because once you understand someone's strategy, interruption only helps them adjust. Letting it play out exposes it. After lunch, Alina suggested coffee in the living room. The group rearranged themselves naturally, Alina and Ruth on the sofa, Daniel slightly apart, the visitor angled toward me. I listened. I answered. I observed. At one point, the visitor asked whether I'd ever considered letting Daniel handle certain responsibilities as things change. I met her eyes and said, no, just that. The room shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough. Later, when the visitor left, Ruth praised how well it all went. Alina looked relieved. Daniel looked confused. That evening, once the house quieted, I called Thomas. They've made their move, I said. Yes, he replied. And now you make yours? The next steps were already prepared. Notifications, clarifications, formal acknowledgments of authority that would be impossible to misinterpret. Not aggressive, not punitive, definitive. The following morning, I told Daniel I needed him home that evening. I didn't explain why. He hesitated, then agreed. When he arrived, Alina and Ruth were already present. I had asked Thomas to join us as well. No one expected that. When Thomas entered, briefcase in hand, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Alina's smile faltered. Ruth straightened in her chair. Daniel froze. I introduced Thomas calmly. My attorney. No raised voices. No accusations, just facts. Thomas explained the structure of my estate, the trust, the clauses, the protections. He spoke clearly, professionally, without emotion. As he spoke, realization spread across Alina's face. Ruth's posture stiffened. Daniel's confusion turned into something closer to shock. The silence afterward was heavy. Ruth spoke first. She questioned the necessity, the tone, the timing. Thomas answered every question without hesitation. Alina asked whether this meant plans would need to be reconsidered. Yes, Thomas said. Immediately, Daniel finally spoke. You knew all this? He asked me. Yes, I replied. I always have. He looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in months. No one argued. There was nothing to argue against. Authority, once established, doesn't need defending. That night, after everyone had left the room, Daniel stayed behind. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner. I answered honestly. Because I needed to know whether you would protect me without being asked. He didn't respond right away. That silence told me more than any apology could. The next few days were quiet. Alina grew distant. Ruth stopped visiting. Conversations became cautious, measured, stripped of assumption. The plan they had built no longer had a foundation. And the house, my house, felt different, not triumphant, settled, because when control returns to its rightful place, it doesn't announce itself, it simply resumes. Control, once reclaimed, doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet, almost anticlimactic, until you realize how much noise it has replaced. After Thomas left that evening, the house didn't erupt into arguments or slammed doors. There were no accusations shouted down hallways, no emotional confrontations that demanded resolution. What settled instead was something heavier. Caution. Alina stopped moving through the house as if it belonged to her. She began asking before making changes. Small things at first: where to store groceries, whether it was all right to invite someone over. The confidence that had once framed her decisions had thinned into something provisional. Ruth didn't return for several days. When she finally did, it was brief, purposeful. She stayed in common areas, spoke politely, and left early. The shift was unmistakable. She understood authority when she encountered it. She just hadn't expected to encounter it here. Daniel tried to act as though nothing had changed. That was his instinct: restore normalcy by pretending the rupture never occurred. He asked about dinner plans, about work, about trivial things that didn't require acknowledgement. But something had changed for him, too. He was no longer protected by ambiguity. One evening, after Alina went upstairs, Daniel stayed behind in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, quiet longer than usual. I didn't know, he said finally. I know, I replied. That was the problem. He told me he'd believed everything would resolve on its own. That everyone just needed time to adjust, that stepping in might make things worse. I thought staying neutral was safer, he said. Neutral for whom? I asked. He didn't answer. The truth was difficult for him to face. Neutrality had never protected me, it had protected his comfort. And now that comfort had been replaced by consequence. Over the next week, Alina's tone shifted again, not softer, but guarded. She spoke less about the future and more about logistics. She asked what my plans were, when I intended to travel, whether I'd considered changing routines, not suggestions anymore, assessments. She was recalibrating. Ruth called once asking to speak privately. I declined. There was nothing left to clarify. Thomas updated me quietly. Certain privileges attached to the trust had been suspended automatically. Nothing public, nothing confrontational. Simply structural outcomes triggered by documented behavior. When Daniel learned this, the realization landed hard. So, this changes things, he said. Yes, I replied. That was the point. He didn't argue, he couldn't. The house grew calmer as assumptions dissolved. Without the illusion of inevitability, plans fell apart on their own. Conversations that once carried momentum now stalled. Alina spent more time out of the house. Ruth stopped offering suggestions entirely, and Daniel began noticing things he hadn't before. The way Alina dismissed my opinions. The way Ruth spoke about me instead of to me. The way decisions had been made without ever asking what I wanted. One evening he apologized, not dramatically, not convincingly, just quietly. I should have paid attention sooner, he said. Yes, I replied, you should have. That was all. Forgiveness doesn't require softness. Sometimes it requires honesty. The following days brought a different kind of tension, not hostile but unresolved. Alina sensed the shift in Daniel. He was less agreeable, less absent. He began questioning timelines. asking why things had been rushed. She didn't like that. I stayed out of their conversations. This wasn't my conflict to manage, it was theirs. My role was finished. One afternoon, I returned from a walk to find the house empty. A note sat on the counter. Alina had gone to stay with her mother for a few days. Daniel would be late. I read the note once and left it where it was. When Daniel returned that night, he looked tired, older somehow. She needed space, he said. So did I replied. He nodded. For the first time since his marriage, we sat together without anyone else shaping the air between us. No urgency, no pressure, just clarity. I didn't realize how close I came to losing everything, he said. You didn't lose everything, I replied. You lost certainty, that's different. He understood. The house was quiet again, not the silence of erasure, but the silence of alignment. And for the first time since the wedding, I slept without listening for voices in the next room. Because whatever came next, it would no longer happen around me. It would happen with my knowledge or not at all. The end of something rarely announces itself. It settles in gradually, like a room returning to its natural temperature after a long disturbance. In the weeks after Alina moved out temporarily, the house became quieter, not empty, but honest. There were no conversations held behind doors, no plans whispered in corners. The air felt unburdened, as if it no longer had to hold competing versions of the future. Daniel stayed, not because I asked him to, not because he didn't know where else to go, but because, for the first time in a long while, he didn't know what he wanted, and he finally understood that uncertainty had consequences. We spoke less, but when we did, the conversations were real. No cushioning, no avoidance. He asked questions he should have asked months earlier, about the trust, about the boundaries, about what I expected now. I answered simply. Respect, I said, and honesty, nothing more, nothing less. Alina called occasionally, always polite. Always cautious. She asked about schedules, about when she might come by to pick up more things. She never asked about the future of the house again. She didn't need to. Ruth didn't call at all. Thomas checked in once just to confirm everything had stabilized. Nothing further was required, no actions pending, no pressure points unresolved. Sometimes, he said, the strongest outcome is the one that requires no further movement. He was right. One afternoon, Daniel told me he and Alina were separating, not dramatically, just factually. He said they needed time apart to reassess what they wanted and how they wanted to live. I didn't celebrate, I didn't mourn, I listened. I didn't realize how much I let happen by staying quiet, he admitted. I thought I was keeping the peace. You were postponing conflict, I said. Those aren't the same thing, he nodded. Over time, he began to change, not suddenly, not performatively, but in small, noticeable ways. He asked before assuming. He spoke up when something felt wrong. He stopped outsourcing responsibility to silence. I didn't guide him. Growth that's coached rarely lasts. The house returned to itself. I rearranged furniture where I liked it. I brought back routines that had been interrupted. Mornings became slow again, evenings quiet in a way that felt earned. Friends noticed the difference. They said I looked lighter, more settled. They were right. Alina eventually came by to collect the rest of her belongings. She was civil, controlled. She thanked me for my patience. I thanked her for respecting the boundaries. That was the entire exchange. When she left, Daniel watched from the window. He didn't follow her. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of what had happened. Later that night, he asked if he could stay longer. Yes, I said, as long as you understand this is my home and my life. I do, he replied, and this time I believed him. Weeks passed, then months. The house became a place of clarity rather than tension. Decisions were made openly. Conversations were direct. Silence, when it occurred, was chosen, not imposed. One morning, as I sat with my tea by the window, I thought about the truth I had kept quiet after the wedding. I hadn't kept it out of fear. I hadn't kept it to test anyone. I had kept it because I understood something then that I understand even more clearly now. Authority doesn't need to be announced. It needs to be protected. The silence that followed that truth didn't weaken me. It strengthened the structure around my life until it could no longer be misused. Daniel came in and sat across from me. We spoke about ordinary things, work, plans, weather. Normalcy had returned, but it was a different kind, one built on awareness instead of assumption. I didn't regain control at the end. I had never lost it. I had simply waited long enough for everyone else to reveal whether they deserved proximity to it. And when they didn't, I let the truth do what it does best when left undisturbed. It corrected the imbalance, quietly, completely.